August 19th, 1944, East Prussia. Deep inside the forest, in a place not even clearly marked on maps, there was a location of enormous importance. This was Adolf Hitler's headquarters, Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. Europe had been burning for more than 4 years. Cities lay in ruins, roads were torn apart by bombs, and millions of people had lost their homes. Every day, another city disappeared from the map. Every night, thousands of civilians hid in shelters, uncertain if they would see the next morning. Yet, in the middle of all this chaos, the fate of the war was being decided inside these concrete walls. Large military maps covered the walls of the room. Red arrows stretched from west to east. These arrows did not merely show front lines, they showed the direction of Germany's defeat. A heavy silence filled the room. A silence so deep that even the rustling of paper could be heard clearly. General Alfred Jodl stood in front of the maps. His face was calm, cold, calculating. In his hands were the latest intelligence reports from the Western Front. One name appeared again and again in those reports: George S. Patton, an American general, aggressive, relentless, unwilling to respect traditional rules. Patton's Third Army was advancing through France at lightning speed. Cities were not falling in days, but in hours. German defensive lines became useless before they were even completed. Yet, despite all this, Jodl did not panic, because he did not believe in Patton. He believed in history. He believed in mathematics. He believed in military doctrine. German military science rested on one unbreakable rule: no army can advance far beyond its supply lines for long. This rule had destroyed Napoleon's army in the Russian winter. This rule had brought Hitler's forces to their knees on the Eastern Front. An armored division consumed approximately 150,000 gallons of fuel per day. That number meant thousands of trucks, thousands of tons of fuel, thousands of men. Patton's tanks, however, were now hundreds of miles away from the Normandy beaches. What lay behind them? Destroyed railroads, blown bridges, bombed and cratered roads. German generals spoke openly. The Americans have advanced too far. What will stop them will not be weapons. It will be logistics. German intelligence ran the calculations. Charts were drawn, numbers were checked again and again. The conclusion never changed. Patton would be forced to halt within 48 to 72 hours. Winter was approaching. Fuel lines were stretching dangerously long. Vehicles were wearing down. If the Americans stalled now, Germany could rebuild defensive lines and prolong the war. Everything made sense. Everything was logical. Everything had been calculated, except for one thing. In war, logic sometimes loses. Because the Germans were asking the wrong questions. How many tanks do they have? How many divisions? The Americans were asking something entirely different. How much can we move? And how fast? This difference did not appear on maps. It was not taught in military academies, but it would decide the fate of the war. Germany was fighting with an army. America was building a system. Patton had no intention of stopping. To him, the greatest danger was not the enemy. It was losing momentum. He issued a single command that changed everything. The flow must never stop. Railroads were unusable. Supply depots were far behind. Traditional logistics had collapsed. The Americans made a radical decision. A system unlike anything in military history would be created. Its name was the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks were mobilized. Roads were converted into one-way highways. One road carried loaded trucks towards the front. A parallel road carried empty trucks back. There were no permissions, no waiting, no delays. The order was simple. Deliver the cargo. Come back. Headlights stayed on at night. According to German doctrine, this was suicide. To the Americans, it was speed. Every 5 minutes, a new convoy rolled out. If a truck broke down and could not be repaired within 15 minutes, it was pushed aside. One truck could stop, the system never could. The Red Ball Express was not just machinery, it was human power. The Red Ball Express was not just machinery, it was human power. More than 23,000 drivers kept the system alive, day after day, night after night. Nearly 3/4 of them were African American soldiers serving in a United States Army that was still segregated. Many of these men were denied combat roles, not because of lack of courage or skill, but because of race. Before the war, many of them worked as farmers, factory hands, or mechanics. Some had never driven long distances before joining the army. Yet now, they were entrusted with the most critical task of the entire campaign. Without them, the advance would stop. They understood that clearly. Driving conditions were brutal. 48 hours without sleep became routine, not an exception. Some drivers stayed awake for 72 hours straight, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands. Coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline replaced rest. The roads were narrow and poorly marked. Rain turned dirt roads into deep mud. Fog reduced visibility to just a few meters. Blackouts were ignored, increasing the risk of air attack. Accidents were constant. Trucks slid off roads. Engines overheated. Collisions were deadly. When a driver was lost, the convoy did not stop. It could not afford to. Every minute mattered. Slowly, an unwritten code emerged among the drivers. If you were slow, you pulled over. If your truck broke down and could not be repaired quickly, you abandoned it without hesitation. There was no room for hesitation. There was no room for emotion. The flow mattered more than the individual truck, more than the individual driver. Over time, the Red Ball Express became more than a supply system. It became a symbol of relentless momentum, a physical expression of American industrial power moving across Europe. Trucks rolled endlessly through French villages, their engines echoing off stone buildings. Headlights burned through the darkness, defying every traditional military rule. German doctrine demanded concealment, spacing, discipline. Vehicles were supposed to hide, to move cautiously, to avoid attention. The Americans did the opposite. German reconnaissance units were stunned. Reports described roads completely filled with trucks, bumper to bumper, stretching farther than the eye could see. According to everything German officers had been taught, this system should have collapsed within days. Instead, it expanded. Patton's Third Army advanced at a speed that defied planning models. 40 miles per day became normal. 50 miles per day was not unusual. Sometimes armored units advanced even faster. German defensive lines were bypassed before they could be fully established. Fortifications that took weeks to build became irrelevant in hours. German commanders were trained to defeat formations. They were not trained to stop momentum. One captured officer later admitted the truth with striking honesty. They had focused on the tanks. They should have focused on the roads. At night, German soldiers heard a sound that unsettled them deeply. It was not artillery fire. It was not aircraft engines. It was trucks, endless trucks. The noise never stopped. Engines growled through the darkness, one after another without pause. For soldiers waiting in defensive positions, it created a sense of inevitability. No matter what they did, the Americans kept coming. That sound carried a message more powerful than any leaflet or broadcast. American supplies never end. French civilians saw the same reality from a different perspective. Roads, once filled with retreating German columns, were now crowded with American trucks. French civilians saw the same reality from a very different perspective. Roads that only days earlier had been filled with retreating German units were now crowded with American trucks moving east without pause. For people who had lived under occupation for years, this endless movement was more than logistics. It was hope made visible. Children ran alongside the convoys, some waving, others simply staring in disbelief. Elderly civilians watched from doorways, unable to fully process what they were seeing. Drivers slowed briefly to hand out chocolate, cigarettes, canned food, and sometimes even fuel for generators. These small gestures carried enormous emotional weight. They were tangible proof that scarcity had been replaced by abundance. For German command structures, the psychological impact was devastating. For years, propaganda had insisted that the Allies were overstretched, disorganized, and nearing collapse. But propaganda could not compete with reality rolling openly down the roads in full daylight. Resistance networks grew bolder. Sabotage increased. Information flowed more freely to Allied intelligence units. The Red Ball Express was no longer just supplying an army. It was actively eroding German confidence and control. By late August and early September 1944, the scale of the operation reached levels unseen in modern warfare. Thousands of trucks moved daily along designated routes. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, and replacement equipment flowed forward in a constant, uninterrupted stream. Success, however, created new challenges. With every mile Patton advanced, supply routes stretched farther across damaged infrastructure. What began as a manageable logistics system evolved into hundreds of miles of exposed roadway, vulnerable to breakdown, weather, and enemy action. Some round trips now exceeded 700 miles. Trucks wore down faster than planners had predicted, tires shredded on rubble-strewn roads. Engines overheated under constant load. Maintenance crews worked without pause, often cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others moving. Spare parts became as valuable as fuel. Drivers pushed themselves beyond exhaustion. Many collapsed at roadside stops, sleeping wherever their bodies finally gave out. Others continued driving despite blurred vision, shaking hands, and growing disorientation. The system demanded endurance, and it extracted a heavy price. German intelligence began to notice the strain. Reports described slower convoys, increased mechanical failures, and visible fatigue among drivers. For the first time in weeks, German commanders felt a flicker of optimism. This cannot continue, some believed. No system can sustain this pace indefinitely. They had reached this conclusion before, and once again, they were wrong. Instead of slowing down, American commanders adapted. The logistics network was reorganized almost overnight. Intermediate depots were established closer to the front lines, drastically reducing the distance individual trucks had to travel. Long routes were broken into shorter, more manageable segments. Driver rotation schedules were introduced to reduce exhaustion. Mobile repair units were pushed forward, establishing makeshift workshops near combat zones. Trucks once considered lost were repaired and returned to service within hours. The Red Ball Express officially ended in November 1944, after 82 days of operation. In that short time, it sustained the fastest armored advance in modern military history, and significantly shortened the war in Western Europe. German Field Marshal summarized the defeat with bitter clarity. "We were defeated not by tanks, but by trucks." The lesson was unmistakable. Logistics is not support, logistics is strategy. And in 1944, the most powerful weapon on the battlefield was not a gun, not a tank, and not an aircraft. It was a truck moving at 35 miles per hour, refusing to stop. Yet the story of the Red Ball Express does not end with numbers, routes, or tonnage delivered. Its true legacy lies in what it changed forever. For centuries, wars had been judged by battles, by generals, by weapons. Victory was measured in territory gained and enemies destroyed. Logistics existed in the background, rarely mentioned, rarely celebrated. 1944 changed that. The Red Ball Express revealed a new reality of modern warfare. That speed could matter more than strength, that momentum could be more decisive than firepower, and that an army's true power was not always at the front line, but far behind it. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were never meant to be heroes. They did not storm beaches, they did not capture cities. Most of them never fired a shot in anger. Many returned home without medals, recognition, or gratitude, but without them nothing else would have moved. Without them Patton's tanks would have run dry. Without them the advance would have stalled. Without them the war would have lasted longer and cost far more lives. Chaucer for fakili fatatafis. German commanders understood this too late. They prepared for tanks. They calculated ammunition. They planned defenses against armies that behaved according to old rules. They never truly prepared for a system that refused to stop. In the years after the war, military thinkers studied the Red Ball Express closely. The lesson was absorbed quietly but completely. Modern armies would never again treat logistics as a secondary concern. Supply became strategy. Movement became doctrine. Industry became a weapon. Today, the highways of Europe no longer echo with the sound of wartime convoys. The trucks are gone. The drivers are mostly forgotten. The roads have returned to peace. But the ideas remains that wars are not won only by those who fight. They are won by those who make fighting possible. The Red Ball Express lasted just 82 days. Yet its impact reshaped warfare for generations. And in the end, the greatest irony of all remains this: Nazi Germany was not defeated by a miracle weapon, not by a single battle, not even by a single general. It was defeated by movement, by coordination, by endurance, by thousands of ordinary men, driving ordinary trucks day and night, refusing to stop. Because in 1944, the most powerful force on the battlefield was not a gun, a tank, or an aircraft. It was logistics, and logistics won the war.